I'm Michelle Fitzgerald, owner of Clockwork Fairy Corsetry, and welcome to this video. This is a video tutorial on how to sew this corset, which we're going to call No Break Corset. There are timestamps in the description of the video because it's rather a long video, so that you can go and pick whatever part you need at that time, just to make navigation a little bit easier. This corset is patterned off of an antique plus-sized Victorian corset. So this is the original size of the corset. It has about a 33-inch waist. And you can see Kenna, who approached me about this project, modeling it in this mock-up that she made to show off the shape and help us see kind of what we wanted to do with it. So she sent it to me, and I took the pattern off of it and looked at the construction and graded it out to a full size range, so you can use it like a multi-size pattern. I really like this corset because it is completely corded. You could put bones, I think, in the seams if you really wanted to, if you wanted like that little bit of extra structure, but the original did not have any bones in there. The only bones in the whole corset are at the back where the lacing strips are. So if you're looking for a comfy, sturdy corset that won't like buckle up at the sides on you, this is a great candidate for that. So I hope you try it. I hope you love it. Let's get into sewing it. Alright, so I'm going to show you how to print this pattern. We'll go over here to Adobe Acrobat Reader and open the PDF file. Now it looks a little scary when you first open it because you're seeing all of the sizes stacked on top of each other. So what we have to do is go over here to the left to the layers. Now this has all of the sizes. What you need to do is unselect the sizes that you don't need. I'm going to make the original size, so that's the one that I'm leaving. You also do want to leave the borders layer on, because that will give you the little diamonds at the sides and tell you what page and what row you're on. This is also a great way to make your own pattern if you have like a bust measurement that fits in one size but a hip measurement that fits in a different size. You can select your second size, and then once it's printed and taped together, you can draw a line to blend the two. Since there's no seam allowance on this yet, that's fairly clear to do. So anyway, once you've got your sizes selected, you go up here to print. You will probably want to hit the size button and make sure the actual size dot is checked. This is set up for A4 paper, so in the US our letter paper is a tiny bit bigger, so you'll have a little bit more kind of extra margin around the edge, but that's okay. Just go by the little diamonds. When that's all set up, you can go ahead and hit print. Please note that there's this 2-inch square on the first page. In case you need to check the scale, you could print like just that one page. Yeah, you go ahead and hit print when you're ready to print. So for the layout on printing, each pattern piece is spread out over 2 pieces of paper. This is to give you enough margins to add seam allowance should you wish it. And you can see it's spread out by rows. A row is the top row, and B, so on and so forth. I like to cut off the margins just to make it easier to see to match up the pattern pieces. And just tape them together. I'm going to be showing you this project. I'm going to cut off, like, there's going to be no seam allowances. In hindsight, I kind of wish I had done like 3/8 inch seam allowances on all the edges and then 1-inch seam allowance on center front and center back, because it didn't shrink as much with the cording as I thought it might. I really had about an even 1/8 of an inch of width lost on each piece. So here's what they look like when they're all spread out. So pretty. If you need to lengthen or shorten them, I'm going to show you that next. So on the pattern there are actually lines marked through the middle of the ribs that say lengthen or shorten here. I'm going to show you lengthening because it's a little more involved, but pretty much the same process in reverse if you need to shorten it. I go ahead and cut it at that line, put my extra paper behind, and then I'm going to use a ruler to draw a line straight up. I'm going to use the cording as my kind of like reference point. I'm going to lengthen it by 1 inch, so that's what you saw me doing just now. And then, yeah, here we go, drawing the, I'm just going to pick like the center cording line to extend up. That'll help me line up the top piece to tape the whole thing back together. And then once you've lengthened it, you can blend the seam lines at the sides again because they might become a little bit offset for the curves. Once that's done, you just trim off the excess on the sides, and voila, you have lengthened the pattern. I don't provide a lengthening or shortening line through the hips just because I don't find it necessary. 99% of the time, leaving the hip as is provides the best result in my corset business, so that's how I'm leaving it here. Very briefly, here's some of the materials. I'll go into more detail in the description about this, but we have cotton twill for the main, fiber rush, 3/32 diameter. You usually use this for chair seating, and then size 00 grommets. I used a cotton twill for this, but you could definitely use coutil. I'm going to be heavily starching this, so just keep that in mind. You definitely need something that will be stiff enough that you can slide the fiber rush through it. I'll also put a list of all the materials I used and links on where to buy them in the description of the video. To start cutting these out, I have first drawn a line with my center back seam allowance. I like to do a really wide center back seam allowance so that that extra fabric goes into the grommet area. So right now I just gave myself that extra seam allowance, and then I traced the pattern piece itself with no seam allowance. This is a really precise way to work because you can see exactly where the seam lines are, and then you just have to add on the seam allowance afterwards. I'm using a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance for both the top and bottom edges and all of the main seams. I then added another 3/8 on top of that width because I didn't know if it was going to shrink or not. This is the starch that I use. For starching each piece after you cut it out, you want to soak it real good. I'm using a spray bottle to do this just because it's a little cleaner than trying to like dip each piece and then let it dry. But yeah, we want to get it nice and soaked with a pretty stiff starch solution. I'm using it diluted 1:1. And then before you iron it, you should let it get like damp. Like there shouldn't be any shiny areas left on the surface of your fabric. There shouldn't be any sort of like puddles. And the reason is because when you leave a puddle like that, often you can get like little flakes of starch stuck to the back of your pieces. This fabric is like fairly double-sided, but I am trying to starch from the back. See, nice and stiff. You'll see some starch flakies because I am impatient. And then as we're going here, I'm remarking the center back seam allowance. I'm using the same fabric for both the inside and outside of this corset, as that's what they did on the original. I know this makes it a little hard to see, so sorry about that, but you can absolutely use coutil for the inside and like a cotton twill for the outside if you want. But I'm using the same for both. So this would be piece 6, the center back piece. You're sewing the inside to the outside. This is just pressing down that center back edge. And now that this is all pressed, we're going to sew the center backbone channels and all the cording channels on this piece. I'm not sure why I chose to show you this on like the opposite side, but here we go. On the wearer's left side, it's a little easier because you can see all the markings. But when I'm doing the right side like this, what I do is just flip the piece over and like mark the ends of all the lines so I can see them. But what I like to do is just use a pen to make little marks at the top and bottom edges, and then I'll connect them with a straight ruler to make it a little bit easier to see and make sure everything ends up super straight. Interestingly, on the original corset, these cording lines are enough uneven that I do think they were all sewn by like a single needle machine. I have seen other corded corsets where they clearly had a machine with like 10 needles and maybe some feeders for the cording, and it sort of could be done all at once, but not this one. This one is definitely sewn like one line of stitching at a time for the corded area. Here we are at the machine, just showing you what this looks like. A lot of factory sewn corsets have this line of stitching like so close to the edge, and I sort of wonder if that was because they were sewing with like a double needle for this area as well as the seams. Anyway, once you get all that sewn, it's time for the cording. So same process, we're just going to mark at the tops and bottoms where all of these little lines will go. I have to say too, making the pieces starched before you start sewing them makes this so much easier to mark because everything stays in place. This is me putting in the cording after they've all been sewn. When you're sewing these cording lines, you can go back and forth or you can do them all from one edge. Either way works. I tried both and I honestly didn't see any discernible difference. The starch really helps with this too. I think they would scoot a lot more if it was not a heavily starched fabric. This is me just checking the final width of piece number 6 because as I said at the beginning, I wasn't sure if I was going to lose width with all the cording. What I found is that I lost about 1/8 of an inch pretty consistently. So that's something that you might want to like just cut this piece and cord it and see, and then however much you lose, you can just add that on to all the rest of your pieces and cut them. And here we go, cutting all the rest of the pieces. Don't forget to cut 4 of each piece if you're using the same fabric for the inside and the outside. Also, don't forget to starch each piece from the back side if you're following my method before you start sewing everything together. You could starch it after you sew, but it's tough with all the texture that gets built into it, and you'd have to have some kind of curve to steam it on as well. We're going to continue on with piece 4 here, marking the cording lines and sewing them. So the next thing will be to sew the seam between piece 4 and piece 5. You can see on the edge of piece 5 where I've marked the top stitching, so all of the seam allowances are going to go, they're going to be on piece 5. I used this seam in my Pretty Housemaid corset as well, so you might remember it from that. We're going to call it the envelope seam. We're sewing all 4 pieces, right sides together all at once. So now they look like this. Piece 4 is kind of sandwiched in between piece 5. I have trimmed down the seam allowances. You don't really need to do it if you're using this kind of thin cotton twill like I am, but if you're using thicker fabrics like coutil, it's very, very helpful to cut down on the bulk. And then we're just pressing piece 5 out like this. I like to do first one side and then the other because it keeps everything nice and neat. Once this all gets pressed, then we can top stitch super close to that seam edge and then again about 3/8 of an inch away to get as close as we can to a copy of that double lock stitch needle machine sewing on the original factory corset. So now we've come back and you can see that I have sewn those 2 lines of stitching. The next thing we're going to do is mark the cording for piece 5 here. To do that, we're going to get piece 5 as flat as possible on the ironing board here. Don't worry about 4. And mark along the top and bottom and then connect up the lines the same way we've been doing. If you're really brave, you definitely could mark just the first one and then use your presser foot as the width. And then here we are, just again checking the width. I did this for each piece because I really wanted it to be precise, but you don't have to. I think it would be fine if you just kind of do it the same every time. So now we have pieces 4 and 5 together, and we're going to connect them up with piece 6. You can see that piece 5 has the top stitching on this edge as well. So we're going to do something a little special. We're going to treat piece 6 like one solid thing, and then we're going to sew to just the back layer of piece 5. This seam method also I used in my Pretty House Made corset. So you can feel free to go check out that video if you want to see possibly some easier colors to see what all's going on. But we're going to press the seam allowance of this towards piece 5. This is the back. And then we're going to turn it over and look at the front. You see currently we have the top layer of piece 5 kind of flipped open. What we're going to do is turn under the edge of piece 5 and match it up with the seam line that we just made on the back. And then we're going to pin it in place and top stitch it super close to the edge. You can clip curves if you need to. Like this. And then I just pin them horizontally every like 1.5 inches, 2 inches, kind of depends on the piece. You're just going to pin the whole edge down like that and then top stitch it through all the layers. This is a great way to make a fully enclosed corset. So now it's time to top stitch those 2 lines of top stitching through all layers. We're going to move on to the front of the corset now. Piece 3 is the next one that we're going to cord because you can see all the seam allowances are on 4 and 2 there. And now that piece 3 is all corded, we're going to do that same tricky seam that we just did with pieces 5 and 6. For attaching piece 2 onto piece 3, we're going to do that same little tricky envelope seam. Put the top layer right sides together on piece 3, and then the bottom layer also right sides together on the back side of piece 3, and you sew it all as one seam. Alright, so since piece 2 is so narrow, we are not going to top stitch this seam just yet. We're going to wait until piece 1 is also attached and make sure we have enough room to run those cording channels down the center of it first. So on to piece 1. We're going to sew the edges of piece 1 first. That'll be the center front edges, and this is where we're going to put the busk in. So here we go. We're going to go ahead and mark the seam allowance on the edges first. Standard busk installation is to have the loop side on the wearer's right and the stud side on the wearer's left. You can, of course, turn this upside down if you wish. That was me just marking the top of where the busk is going to go. You will notice that this corset has quite a short busk and a little bit of extra space at the lower edge. If you want to copy as the antique had it, go ahead and do it. If not, feel free to use a longer busk. But I'm just marking where we're going to leave spaces to put the loops through. So to sew this, we're going to sew along that seam where we've marked and then sort of hop over the loop areas. The stud side, you just sew the whole way down and then we'll poke the holes for the studs later. Let's go ahead and sew the loop side first. So you can see the little marks I've made for where we need to leave it open for the loops to go through. I usually try to do a back stitch or two in the seam on both sides of where the loop side is going to be open. Don't have to, I just kind of like to. Here too, I find that having the starched fabric really helped, because when it's not starched, the fabric can sort of bunch up where the back stitches are. So hooray for starch. Definitely recommend trying it out if you've never worked with starched fabric. Just be more patient than me so you don't get all these starch flakies on the back sides of your fabric. For both pieces now, we're just going to press them open and then press the edge. Same as we did for piece 6. This is a $3 IKEA spice rack wooden plank that I've been using this whole time as a clapper to kind of take the steam out really quickly and make a super crisp edge. Definitely recommend. Great tool to have in the pressing. So once we've put the busk in, we need to sew along the side of it, and you can be wild and crazy and just do this with like a zipper foot, or you can baste it first. It kind of depends on the fabric for me, but in this case I'm going to show you the nice way to do it, just in case. So I'm taking this cotton basting thread and just doing like large stabby stitches right next to the busk, just to help keep it all right up next to the edge while I'm sewing it. And it really does help, I have to say. It makes for a much less stressful experience trying to sew the busk in. And now that we've sewn the loop side, we're going to move on to the stud side of the busk. I want to make sure that the studs are closer to the center front because they are a little bit offset on their piece of boning usually. We're going to lay the loop side over, match up the top bottom edges, and then mark where to punch holes for the studs. Now you can use an actual hole punch for this if your fabric's really stiff, or an awl. Either one works great. I'm going to use the awl this time because it's working fairly well for me. I do punch through the seam allowance as well, just to make it extra sturdy, and because you do want that wide seam allowance to go on top of the busk, this is going to help provide a little bit of cushion to the edge where we're sewing it down. And once you've got all of the holes punched or poked with the awl, you kind of work them over the top of the studs. I find this easiest to do like kind of from one side. I'm not doing a very good job of showing it to you. There you go. Kind of get it under the edge of the studs and then work the rest over it. But yep, once these are all on, we're going to do the same procedure of basting the edge down if you want, and then sewing through all layers with a zipper foot so you can get right up close to the edge of the busk. Alright, and now that we've got the busk all set in, it's time to do the cording on piece 1. At this point, you know the drill. You just mark the marks at the top and bottom, connect it up with straight lines, sew it, put the cording through it. Amazing. And then here we are. We're going to put this whole corset together now. To attach piece 1 to piece 2, we're going to use that same little tricky seam method we used for piece 5 and 6 and elsewhere in the corset. However, we're going to do it on the front side of the corset first and then fold under the back side because this makes a much neater end result from the front side. And I just want to show you that you can do it either way. So this time we're going to sew all of piece 1 to just the top layer of piece 2. We come back, here's the outside of it, and then here's the inside. And so we just need to do the same thing that we've done, where we press everything towards piece 2 with a nice shape, you know. And then we're going to fold under the seam allowance of piece 2. When I'm doing it this way, I am going to stitch it from the front side still. So what I do is I leave a little more room on piece 2. Instead of making this fold like exactly meet my stitch line, I give it an extra millimeter or 2. And I like to use these really big quilting pins because I can like feel them really easily as I'm sewing and take them out before I hit them. So now we're going to top stitch from the front side like a millimeter away from the seam. And it's nice too, when we're this close to the edge, it's really easy to just flip it up and see where all the pins are. Now that that's done, we're going to go ahead and do the edge top stitching on the other side that we didn't do when we first attached piece 2 onto piece 3. Now, since this piece has 2 corded channels running down the center of it, I'm going to first stitch straight down the center. In this case, since there's not any bones going in those bone channels, I don't care as much about the final width that they end up with. I think if that was the case though, I would cheat the corded channel width. In this case though, what I'm trying to do is come up with a cording channel that's not going to be too tight. So I'm just going ahead and stitching the channels here for each little corded bit. And that's piece 2. Now we can put the corded pieces in. Alright, so now it is time to mark the grommets. We're also going to be binding the edges soon. You can mark them both at the same time, or you can do grommets on one side of the corset first and then just lay it over the other side and mark like through the grommets to make sure it's exactly symmetrical. Alright, now we're going to trim up the top and bottom edges so that we can do the binding. I have marked my 3/8 inch seam allowance. If yours, like mine, has shifted just a little bit, just kind of split the difference if the seam lines aren't quite matched up. I'm using a rotary cutter to trim because I love it. It's a nice, easy way to get through all of this cording. I really want to make sure that both sides match up at the center front, so I'm going to double check that real quick and just start cutting while they're together. For binding the edge, this time I'm going to show you a petersham ribbon binding method. This is also how this particular factory corset was bound and how many were bound. If you do not want to buy petersham ribbon, you can use the same method from my Pretty Housemaid corset video. But I absolutely love this binding method because I find it just so fast and easy and durable. I did show this binding method on my 1780s stays video as well, so if you want to learn all about getting into curves and corners, you can go check that video out. But for this corset, it's such a gentle curve. It's a great way to explore this technique. I'm sewing it all in one go. I'm sure at a factory they probably had a folder attachment to kind of help with this, but for us, we're just going to make sure that when we lay it on the back side's a tiny bit wider than the front side so that there'll be no gaps. If you wanted to like pre-clip all this with Wonder Clips or something, I think that would be a good way to make sure that you're not going to leave any gaps. For finishing the edge, I like to cut the thread about 1 inch away so that I kind of have room to do the same little tricky fold. We're going to fold the length first, like this, and then fold the whole thing down on the back. Since this corset is such a gradual curve, I don't find myself needing tweezers as much for the actual sewing of it, but sometimes for things like the corners, if the under fold like wants to peek out or something, these angled serger tweezers could be really, really helpful tools. And that's the edge binding. Just gotta clip the little threads and there we go. And once you've bound the top edge, you could do bottom or top edge because it doesn't really matter, but you do need to leave one open so that you can at least put in the bones for the center back eyelet area. Usually I like to do grommets or eyelets before I put these bones in, but this corset had such a narrow area for the eyelets that I wanted to put the bones in first. It totally is up to you, whichever way you'd like to do it. On the pattern I marked it, the original bones in the antique corset were a good 2 inches shorter than the channel. So if you are wanting to make a strict reproduction, you can cut them to the length shown on the pattern. If not though, I would definitely recommend making them the full length of the channel, or even, a 1/4 inch shorter or so. I'm using synthetic whalebone or baleen for these channels because I have it and I love it, but steel is what was in the original antique. If you too really like the synthetic whalebone, this is 6 millimeters wide by 1.5 millimeters thick, so it's a little bit thicker than the ones you'd use for the body of the corset. Here we are, marking the other side of the grommet strip. I like to do this like after it's all bound, just because sometimes you lose a little bit of height in the binding. So keep them all even. One of the nice finishing steps I like to do is to bend the belly area of the busk a little bit. This isn't necessarily to make a rounded belly, it's just to keep it from really dishing out at the lower end of the busk. So when you get some tension on the belly, it won't stick straight out. It'll at least be pushed into more of a straight down position. But yep, I just kind of bend it over my hands. I get asked about this a lot from when I did it in the Pretty Housemaid video. You could use the edge of a table or something too if you wanted, but I like to just use my hands and bend it while it's snapped together so it's the same on both sides. And then I also wanted to show you how I lace it up. I really like to use the bunny ears style of lacing, and I also use the style of lacing where it makes X's on the front so that it can lace fully closed edge to edge if need be. You end up with these long loops at the waist so that you can individually tighten ribs or hips. Once it's all tightened up, you can just tie it into a bow like this. I leave the tails longer so I know which ones to pull to let it out. But I've also seen people wrap it around front or tie it even under the busk in front, so you have so many options. This is the end of the machine sewing though, and you could stop here if you want, but I'm also going to show you sewing some lace along the top edge. So the original factory corset had a really cute, like, scalloped jacquard trim attached along the top edge that I could not find a modern equivalent of, but I do have this really cute 1/2-inch lace that's the same size. You could attach it as I just showed, or you could kind of pop it up along the top edge like earlier corsets. I feel like I see this more on 1850s and 60s corsets, but it's total preference. I'm going to be hand sewing this on just because you definitely could machine sew it on, I think, but through how thick it is, I feel like the machine is gonna make too much of a like textural impact on the lace, which I really don't want. Since it's such a thin lace, it's about 1/2 inch wide, I'm just going to attach it with a running stitch into the binding. So here I am pinning it on just to make sure it's going to travel around the curves okay. You absolutely can use a wider lace. I've seen even up to 2 or 3 inches wide. With that though, you'll probably need to do 2 rows of running stitches, one along the top edge and one along the lower edge, and you'll have to be a little more careful about the curves, where you might have to gather in a curve going under the bust or going around the underarm. But yeah, to secure this lace, we are just going to fold under the edges on the wrong side of the corset. Watch out for those pins, they love to snag. Like so. And so then when I start hand sewing it on, the first thing I'll do is whip stitch along that folded edge and then poke through to the right side and just running stitch on all along the edge. I'm using just a normal like sew all polyester thread.